Hey, here we are back again with a new episode of Chrontendo, this time covering December 1989 through January 1990. We have some really terrible games here, so this is going to be kind of rough going today. So there are a few announcements to make. First of all, episode 54 is going to be the last episode of Chrontendo. That covers 15 games. Starting next episode, each episode will cover 10 games. At this point, I've had it up to here with these hour-and-a-half long videos. Reducing the number of games will allow me to make these things faster, and just so you know, YouTube lets me see everything. I know you guys only watch the first half hour of these videos. Also, it was mentioned in the last Chronturbo episode, but once again I'll announce there is now officially a Chrontendo Patreon. I'll start putting the link in the descriptions of these videos. Any patrons who want their names added to the list of patrons in the credits, just send me a message on Patreon stating how you want your name to be listed. And I guess I'm supposed to tell you guys to like and subscribe, and there's also supposedly a bell button that you should press, or that's what YouTubers always say. One last thing, this video has been created using a new rendering process, so I'm hoping it looks a little better, assuming that YouTube's own rendering doesn't make it look like crud. Alright, so let's get started. I have a rather shocking piece of news for you, dear listeners. I am not perfect, and I do make mistakes, and it's been brought to my attention that I skipped a game from December 15th. A baseball game, which isn't too surprising because there were 5-6 baseball games in December? So here it is, Famicom Yakyuu Ban. Now this is a rather grandiose title screen for such an unassuming little game. We get various gameplay options here. These are great little illustrations. This was developed by Sakata SAS and published by Epoch, the first Epoch game for the Famicom. Now, Sakata SAS was, I believe, mostly involved in game programming rather than creative decisions. We've seen them do a lot of stuff for Data East, like the port of Karnov. Now, one thing about this game, the team lineup is goofier than normal. Famicom baseball games tend to have silly fake names for the teams, but this goes above and beyond the norm. So yeah, this is just a regular baseball game, alright? But there is a weird concept behind the game, at least sort of. So you guys know what Yakyuu is, right? It's baseball, but what is Yakyuu Ban? Well, that is simply the Japanese name for what we call baseball pinball games. That is a small baseball game toy that works like a pinball table. The ball is propelled by a spring and can be hit with a flipper, at least on the fancier models like this one here. Smaller, cheaper versions are much simpler. Now these things have been popular in Japan for ages, so the idea of a Yakyuu Ban video game makes sense. Now this one was manufactured by Epoch, who was actually a Japanese toy company founded in 1958. In the mid-70s, Pong was all the rage, and in 1975 Epoch released the TV Tennis Electro Tennis, the first Japanese video game console, though Epoch didn't actually manufacture this themselves. They soon started to develop various video game systems such as the TV Vader, which was simply a Space Invaders clone with the joystick built right into the console. As well as this, there was the Cassette Vision, followed by the Super Cassette Vision, which was released in 1984, so shortly after the Famicom. About 30 games were released between 84 and 86 for this console. There were a number of arcade game ports such as Mappy, nothing too exciting as far as I know. After some time, Epoch withdrew from the console market, and here they are now with their first Famicom game. They released some odd titles, like tons of Doraemon games, a couple Disney Super Famicom games that were never released in the US. Epoch no longer makes video games now, but seems to still have a relationship with Nintendo. Their main product line seems to be a series of cute little animal figures called the Sylvania families, but they also make stuff like Super Mario toys and BTS jigsaw puzzles. So anyway, going back to the game, it's a very normal baseball game, and it looks almost identical to Namco's Family Stadium games. If we just sort of superimpose the two, well, you see what I mean. Now, one odd quirk, the first time I played this, I was just getting my ass kicked by the other team, pretty much like every other baseball game I've played on this series. But later, I played with different teams, and suddenly the CPU was just an imbecile, getting struck out, failing to catch balls. Typically, every ball you hit in these things just goes blam right into an outfielder's glove, but not in this case. So some teams in this game are maybe just bad. Now, one cool thing, I love the animation where you beam the batter with a pitch. They really went the extra mile here. So that wraps up baseball games until the end of March, I think. So now let's pick up where we left off last episode. Let's move on to our first real game of this episode, Batman from Sunsoft. Released on December 22nd in Japan and February 1990 in the US under the name Batman, the video game. It begins with this sort of annoying intro which uses a lot of flickering effects and sort of runs down the plot of the movie, complete with pixelated recreations of Jack Nicholson and Kim Basinger. As you undoubtedly know, this is the official video game adaptation of the smash hit 1989 movie, courtesy of the dubious talents of the guy who made the wet t-shirt Jaws movie, and Barbra Streisand's former hairdresser/boyfriend. Batman the movie took a while to get made. The producers bought the movie rights in 1979, and while Batman itself wasn't that great of a picture, the marketing campaign was phenomenal, and it could be said that Batman the movie more or less created the modern Hollywood blockbuster. Now, one side effect of its success was that it knocked loose a lot of money for other stalled comic book adaptations. So suddenly Warren Beatty's old Dick Tracy project got funded, and we'll be seeing video game adaptations of these post-Batman comic book movies later on in the Chrontendo series. So Batman the video game is a little weird. First of all, let me say, Batman is a quality game. Clearly time and money went into this. The art direction is fantastic. I mean, just look at these backgrounds. Look at the lighting on everything in the background. Batman himself looks great. He's clearly recognizable as Batman and very well animated. Like, look at the way his cape moves when he walks. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that gave Sunsoft a great reputation in the late 80s, early 90s. But it doesn't really feel like a Batman game, and it sure doesn't feel like an adaptation of the movie at all. It has some of the dark, shadowy atmosphere of the movie, but that's about it. There aren't really any recognizable locations from the film. The first level is a city level, which I guess makes sense, but then we move into like a rather vaguely science fiction industrial compound of some sort, the kind of thing you might see in Contra or Bionic Commando, and these sections feel more like a sci-fi Castlevania. None of the enemies are taken from the movie either, with the exception of the Joker, who is the final boss, and he has a lightning attack, and the background in the final boss scene does look like a church tower. So that is basically the one part of this game that clearly references the movie. And this really isn't at all true of the other Batman games. For example, the computer version from Ocean Software is completely different and very clearly based on the movie. For example, you can clearly recognize Tracy Walter's character as the Joker's henchman in this game. So the question is, is Batman the video game any good? Well, Lord knows the kids liked it back in 1990. It feels sort of like a slower version of Ninja Gaiden, mostly due to Batman wall jumping a lot, though this seems more like Spider-Man than Batman in my opinion. For attacking, Batman can punch, of course. He also has 3 ranged weapons. Obviously there's the Batarang, which is presumably non-lethal unless you take one to the windpipe or the eye. However, this game makes the very unusual choice to give Batman a gun, which he uses to straight up kill people with. Batman lore says he never uses a gun and doesn't kill people, and yeah, you guys have given me examples of Batman killing people, like in Batman Returns when he sticks a sling of dynamite on some henchman's chest and blows him up. But still, this is the only Batman game I can think of where Batman shoots people. The manual says it's a spear gun, which is, quite frankly, probably even worse than being shot by a bullet. Batman also shoots 3 tiny missiles at enemies, which, again, sounds pretty lethal. The manual calls this a dirk for some reason. Other weird factors, so other than the Joker, none of the game's enemies really seem to come from the Batman comics, but in the manual they've all been given names of Batman villains, and they had to dig up some obscure ones, like this flying guy is supposed to be the Killer Moth, who was really more of a Batgirl villain by this point, and guys like Deadshot and the Electrocutioner. Again, the sprites look nothing like the actual comic book characters. So this is, of all the Batman video games, this is the one that is really like the least sort of Batmanish. If you replace Batman's sprite with something else, you would never guess this was Batman related. Even the Batarang isn't bat-shaped. All of this certainly leads me to believe that the Batman license was added on relatively late in the development process, and that this was originally going to be some completely different property. So Batman is certainly a well-loved NES game, but as someone who didn't play it back when it first came out, to me it just feels like there's way too much annoying bullshit, and it feels too repetitive, especially coming right after playing Castlevania 3, a game which was tough, but it never felt cheap and seemed to offer something new on every screen. For me, that's just not the case with Batman, and I simply don't have the patience or the inclination to deal with this game. December 23rd, and aren't we in luck? A Mahjong game! This one published by Natsumi. Chuugoku Janshi Story, Tonpuu, or Chinese Sparrow Stone, East Wind. The word Mahjong comes from the Chinese word for sparrow. East Wind refers to the position of the dealer who plays first. The menu screen has a few options in regard to the game rules. You also have the ability to turn off the music and sound effects. For this, we'll just leave the music on. This is a tournament game, and guess who's not going to be winning the Gold Cup? That's right, me. This all looks pretty typical here, just a standard Mahjong game from the looks of it. However, I will point out that the developer is a company called Zap. They were mostly a developer of computer games for the MSX and such. We have seen one other game from them a while ago, Enkoku Shinwa, which was an adventure game. There was one game from them that got a Western release, which is actually a TurboGrafx 16 shoot-'em-up called Dead Moon. Zap developed a number of other titles, the most notable of which may have been Twinkletail, one of the rarer and most expensive Mega Drive games, though you can find plenty of cheap reproduction cards online. Of course, there's really nothing unique about this particular game, it's just another of the many, many Mahjong games on the Famicom. We have two JRPGs today. I guess late winter, early spring is RPG season in Japan, so we're sort of kind of getting warmed up here. Hercules no Eikou II from Data East, or technically Herakles. This is the second game in the Herakles no Eikou series, as you probably figured out from the name. Now, like most Famicom RPGs, this was not released outside of Japan, but we have a pretty slick translation from Spoony Bard that will allow us to slog our way through this thing if we wanted to. Now, as you will have noticed, this game looks extremely 8-bit RPG-ish. This is like very much absolutely boilerplate NES-era RPG. You are called upon to save the world from demons or titans or something. In order to start your quest, you actually need to go into your house and check your bed for an invisible letter. The letter is from the Queen, who needs you to assist with the war on the Lord of Darkness. So your mom gives you Dad's old sword and shield, which are crap and you should get rid of them as soon as possible. Once you make your way to the Queen, she gives you an update on the war with the Titans, and says she needs you to go to Athens and find Homer. Yes, Homer, the guy who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. To get to Athens, you need to go down to the port and hop on a ship, which takes you to Athens, which looks an awful lot like your hometown. Oh yeah, and in case you're wondering, so your character is not Hercules, you're just some dumb kid. Hercules gets talked about a lot in the game, and eventually joins your party, but no, you do not get to play the game as the immortal demigod Hercules. Eventually you need to set out into the world and, wander around in circles, grinding for experience points. The translation is pretty charming. You say things like ta and there when attacking. One interesting element is the game does utilize a night and day cycle. Some buildings will be closed at night, and others, like the bar, for example, will be busy at night, and there are going to be unique interactions when in the towns at night. In fact, later you'll need to poke around a town at night in order to recruit a new party member. We covered the first Hercules game way back in Chrontendo number 18, and wow, this did not really hold up visually at all. At the time, I think that I recall this as being the first Famicom game to explicitly model itself on Dragon Quest, and it's pretty clearly still doing that 2.5 years later. The artwork here has got this vibe of Disneyland's It's a Small World ride, but on a positive note, you do play as Hercules in this game. Data East continued to make Hercules games in the 90s with 2 Super Famicom titles and 1 Game Boy entry. Then all of a sudden the series was unexpectedly revived by Nintendo with Glory of Hercules for the DS. Its 2010 release in the US made it the first game in the series to be officially released in English. Now, one little nugget of trivia. The writer on Glory of Hercules 2 is Kazushige Nojima, who later moved to Square and wrote such games as Final Fantasy VII and 8. Also, Kingdom Hearts. I guess everyone had to start somewhere. Anyway, as you go through this thing, you'll eventually need to enter a dungeon, or technically a cave, and fight the first boss, Cerberus, the famous 3-headed dog. Or rather, Cerberus, the 2-headed dog in this case. The developers couldn't afford to hire the real dog, apparently. Just like all JRPGs of this time, dungeons are just absolute nightmare slogs with random battles happening every 2 steps. You better be stocked up on healing items. Now luckily you get a second party member before too long. When you finally track down Homer, he says you need to find the Chaos Axe to defeat the Lord of Darkness, but only Hercules can wield the axes, and Hercules is in heaven, as the game says. So yeah, that's definitely a problem. Also in this town, you find a bunch of kids are bullying a centaur and have buried him halfway into the ground. So what to do? Well, the kids are surrounding him all day, but if you return to the area at night, the kids are home asleep and you can free him. Your next dungeon crawl takes you to the Minotaur, and after defeating him you'll find the third party member, Who's this statue lady? Having additional party members can sure help, especially since status elements are going to be a major problem for you. Enemies that can poison you appear non-stop. Just as bad are those that can put you to sleep, and unlike in some games, you don't wake up when you get hit or when the battle is over. You'll stay asleep permanently until healed. And here's something I don't recall seeing in any other JRPG of this time. Certain monsters can actually break your equipment. Like, permanently break it. Once this happens, it's unusable for good. I mean, even by Famicom RPG standards, this is pretty cruel. So is Glory of Hercules 2 any good? I mean, it's kind of amusing, especially in the way that it just completely mixes up all these different elements and eras of Greek mythology into like a weird stew. I think the later Super Famicom games are more fondly remembered than this one. However, we do have another JRPG later in this same episode, which is a bit more interesting. So this is it, Super Rugby, the last game of 1989, released on December 27th. This is the first, and I believe last, Rugby game released for the Famicom, though there was an unrelated game for the Super Famicom, also called Super Rugby. We have a rugby ball in the background, which is very similar in shape to a football, though the ends of a rugby ball are a bit more rounded. This was published by TSS, an extremely minor publisher who only released 2 other console games to my knowledge. A Famicom boxing game and a PC Engine shoot-'em-up. Now the weird thing is, Super Rugby was developed by Zap, the developer of Chuugoku Janshi Story. They only did 3 games for the Famicom, that we know of, and 2 of them are in today's episode. Naturally, we have the standard single game mode, tournament mode, and player versus player modes. I'm playing as Club A. You can change the team's name if you wish. This being a game from 1989, there are RPG-type elements added in. You can assign skill points to various attributes. Real quick, let me note the odd detail that your player's photo is attached to the virtual stats page with pieces of Scotch tape. I think the thing along the left side is the ring wire binding of a notepad. Your level is 60, which means that you can assign 60 points to the various stats, most of which are obvious, except for Technique. I have no idea what that does. First team up is the Angels, and these are some weird names. Dada? S. James? Super Rugby is pretty obscure, even in Japan. There's very few reviews or videos about this game. I did find a couple of Japanese gamers who did brief videos on this, but for the most part there seems to be very little interest in this game, even in Japan. To make matters confusing, there's a real-life international rugby league called Super Rugby, and Japan is a member of this league, but it was formed in 1996, so this game is obviously not named after it. This plays more or less like most soccer games. One button cycles between the various players on the field, and the other button tackles when you're playing defense. When you have the ball, you can either pass or kick, and that's it really. If you're not familiar with rugby, it's in the family of ball games that includes soccer and American football. All 3 games derived from some older proto-football game. As rules were formalized and player associations were formed, there ended up being 3 very distinct football games. Rugby has always been semi-popular in the US, but way below football, baseball, and basketball. I've always associated rugby with like prep schools, sort of like lacrosse, a rich kid sport, maybe the male equivalent of field hockey. The one really notable thing about Super Rugby is the graphics. They look weird. The players have like 1970s action figure bodies, and they look really stiff. Check out the animation for scoring a goal. Now I am absolutely terrible at this, and I can't quite figure out why. I simply could not tackle. My player would just fly right through the opposing team's guy and never connect. I think I made 1 successful tackle while playing this. Needless to say, I lost horribly, and I had to suffer through the triumphant chanting of the Angels' army. Well, 1989 ends not on a bang, but Well, not even a whimper really. It ends on a totally forgotten game which is of no interest to anyone, but we do still have to clear the deck of Western releases before moving on to 1990. Alright, we are done with every Japanese Famicom release of 1989, and we are now going to finish off this year with some Western games. Released sometime in December 1989 was Silent Service from Konami, or rather, Ultra Games. As you might recall, Nintendo of America typically allowed publishers to release only 5 games for the NES a year. However, a few favored publishers, Konami being one, were allowed to work around the rule by publishing games under their Ultra Games imprint. Acclaim was also allowed to break the 5 per year rule. Silent Service was developed by Rare, who was responsible for about half of the US exclusive NES games coming out at this point. They just pumped these things out at an insane rate. Quite frankly, this is kind of a weird release. It's a somewhat sophisticated submarine simulation game. As you can see, you basically use the controller like a mouse, using it to select various options and control your submarine. This doesn't really feel appropriate for a D-pad and a 2-button controller. It should probably come as no surprise that this is a port of a computer game originally published in 1985 by Microprose and designed by Sid Meier. This was released on many computer platforms, DOS, Amiga, all that stuff. Meier had made several flight simulation games in the early to mid-80s, and began branching out with submarine games like this and Red Storm Rising, as well as other types of simulation games like Pirates in 1987, Railroad Tycoon in 1990, and finally Civilization in 1991. A few of these Microprose games got NES ports, most notably Pirates. As for me, I am really not into this. This seems way too complicated for an NES game. I mean, just look at all this stuff. It just seems weird and inappropriate playing a game like this with an NES controller. I mean, just look at the manual for this thing. It goes on and on. It's insane. So here's the short version. There are 3 game modes: Convoy Action, where you hunt down and attack convoys, and War Patrols, the most involved mode, where you gallivant all over the ocean and attack enemy ships. Now there's a bunch of gameplay options which will increase or decrease the difficulty. So throughout the game you're going to be controlling the ship, diving, surfacing, keeping an eye on the ship's condition, making repairs, and of course engaging enemy ships and trying to sink them. You have both a turret gun of some sort, as well as of course torpedoes. There's nothing really wrong with Silent Service, it's just not my cup of tea. I'm sure some kids really dug it back then, but I just can't get into it. Here is another undated US release, Championship Bowling, published by Romstar, which was SNK's US distribution arm, though they also handled US distribution for other Japanese companies as well. They released games like Sidearms, Arkanoid II, Tiger Road, Rambo 3. This is the second Romstar game for the NES that we've seen, the first being Twin Eagle, a vertical shoot-'em-up that we covered in episode 50. So first of all, let's point out, this guy is packing. Nice of this game to throw in a little something for the ladies. Also, the woman here appears to be flipping us off for some reason. If we add in the bizarre appearance of a penguin and a rabbit for no reason, we get a really weird title screen. Alright, so let's select our character. There's no difference between these four aside from their appearance, with one exception, the blonde guy. He is left-handed, while the other three are all right-handed. Now the one thing that does make a big difference is the weight of the ball that you choose. You have 5 options ranging from 7 to 15 pounds. Now the heavier balls will hit the pins with more power, and the lighter balls will be able to be thrown in a more dramatic curve. It'll be much harder to get a good curve on the heavier balls. Championship Bowling is a completely unoffensive bowling game. There's nothing really to complain about here, there's nothing to get excited about either. It's just bowling with no frills whatsoever. In fact, this could have been a lot worse considering that it was developed by another, famous for the Black Bass video game as well as Hoshi Omirohito, the worst RPG on the Famicom. A couple other points of interest while we're looking at this. Championship Bowling was originally an arcade game released by Romstar, also in 1989. In fact, the NES box art is taken directly from the arcade flyer. However, the game itself looks nothing like the arcade version, which used a trackball for the controls and had fancy graphics and voice samples.
Give up. Go for it.
The NES version must have been developed completely separately. Also, as you probably remember from the title card a few minutes ago, this game did get a release in Japan in 1991. However, it was published by Athena instead of Romstar. The Athena version appears to be absolutely identical except for the word Athena appearing when the pin setter comes down. Also, I'll point out that the design of the lady bowler makes her look like she's wearing a skirt that's way too short and black thong underwear. So we'll now wrap up 1989 with some Tengen games. Okay guys, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we're going to close off 1989 with not 1, not 2, not even 3, but 4 Tengen games. No idea exactly when these were released, but they're all dated 1989, and all of them are ports of arcade games. As you might recall, Tengen was the product of Atari Games, not to be confused with Atari Corporation, which at this point was a completely separate company that produced the Atari 7800, the Lynx, the Jaguar, etc. Atari Games was the former Arcade Games division of Atari, and thus quite a few Tengen carts are ports of Atari arcade games. Let's start off with a couple which will be very familiar to viewers of the Chron series, Fantasy Zone and Shinobi. Atari Games ported a few Sega games for the NES. After all, we wouldn't expect Sega to publish games for the NES themselves. Fantasy Zone, like all the other Tengen games this episode, were unlicensed. Tengen had released a few licensed carts in 1988. There was Pac-Man, Gauntlet, and Namco's RBI Baseball, but they rather sneakily acquired the code for the NES lockout chip and then started releasing carts that were not licensed, which set off several years of litigation. And this was in addition to Tengen's legal battles with Nintendo over Tetris, which we covered in some detail in episode 45. But back to Fantasy Zone. This is of course a port of Sega's 1986 arcade game, which is delightful and cute. It has great music, one of Sega's best arcade games of the period. Your little ship Opa Opa flies around, killing various creatures and stealing their money, which you can then spend on bigger and better weapons. It's all very charming. I'm pretty sure Fantasy Zone was ported to literally every video game platform that ever existed. We've already seen a few versions in the Chron series, but the odd thing is this. This is the second port of Fantasy Zone for the NES. That's right, in episode 20 we looked at Sunsoft's port, which was released only in Japan in 1987. And Tengen didn't actually just release Sunsoft's port in the US, they actually made a completely different version. And honestly, I'm not sure which one is worse. Neither are exactly beautiful. Sunsoft's has ugly colors and distractingly busy backgrounds. Tengen's comes closer to the pastel color scheme of the original, but still manages to look quite ugly and flickery, and in motion it looks very jerky. The music might also be worse. And what is very odd is that horizontal line of garbage separating the box at the bottom from the main part of the screen. As far as I can tell, this isn't any sort of emulation glitch. This is actually how it plays in the original game. Overall, Tengen's Fantasy Zone isn't really an enjoyable experience. I suppose it's probably considered to be worse than Sunsoft's, but honestly, neither one of these is really great. Oh wow, does this look familiar? Maybe because we just saw it in the last episode of Chrontendo. Yes, it is, once again, Shinobi. There are so many versions of this, I just don't know. Well, we are all familiar with Sega's 1987 arcade hit, Shinobi. You're a ninja named Joe Musashi who has to rescue some kids or something. You're walking around throwing your little ninja stars and occasionally slicing someone up with your sword or using ninja magic. Now previously in Chron Sega we saw the version released for the Master System, which was actually slowed down and a somewhat more strategic version of the arcade game. It was pretty good, I guess. Then there was the PC Engine version by Asmik, released on December 8th. It felt a bit more like the arcade game, although with some missing levels, and you no longer had those special melee attacks when you get up close to an enemy. And now we have the Nintendo Entertainment System version. And, you know, it's not exactly great. It feels much slower than the arcade game. Joe just sort of strolls across the screen. You can also only throw one projectile at a time, which I guess was because of due to sprite limitations. The level design seems very similar to the Master System version. It feels more like a port of that game than it does the arcade original. Now a few notable things about this version. Rescuing the kids sometimes gives you bonuses like refilling your health meter, or giving you slightly better but still very boring weapons. And sometimes it gives you just points. On the other hand, in order to obtain ninja magic, you have to earn it by beating the bonus levels. You know, the ones where all the ninjas come up and jump at you. And this is, like, insanely hard. So unlike the arcade Shinobi, you can't really rely on ninja magic to help you with the boss battles. Just like the Tengen Fantasy Zone, there are these strange little graphical glitches, like those flashing pixels below your life bar. I mean, it's not horrifically ugly, but it looks like a very generic NES action game. You wouldn't even know that Joe is a ninja just by looking at him. He could be some kind of like generic army dude based on his character sprite. Bottom line, this is a very eccentric port of Shinobi that feels like a whole different game. It's not exactly terrible. Obviously today there's a million ways to play Shinobi at home. So when it comes down to Shinobi ports, as you kids would say today, this ain't it, chief. Now here's an arcade game port that nobody asked for. Roadrunner, a not especially well-remembered arcade game from 1985, manufactured by Atari, so it was 4 years old at this point, which in the world of 1980s video games was a lifetime. 89 was the year Final Fight and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were in arcades, and compared to those, Roadrunner was a very simple quarter muncher. Now the idea is quite simple. You are the famously speedy Roadrunner and are being chased by Wile E. Coyote. The object is simply to not let him catch you. Now you can run faster than Wile, but there are some complications. First of all, you can't just leave Wile in the dust. If you get too far ahead of him, he'll suddenly get rocket-powered roller skates and chase you around at high speed. Throughout the game there are also various gizmos he will pick up that will give him a temporary advantage over you. The first is this rocket, which zooms back and forth across the screen very fast, allowing him to simply grab you and carry you away. You can avoid this by standing near a vertical intersection and moving up or down when he appears at the edge of the screen. Once you reach a predetermined point on this level, Wile will lose his gizmo. Now the arcade game was actually quite a bit more attractive looking, and in 1985 it looked just amazing, what with the very fast action and parallax scrolling. Also, the use of some very well-known Warner Bros. Cartoon characters was pretty novel. There weren't really many games using licensed characters at that time. The original series of Roadrunner cartoons ran from the 1950s until 1966, becoming very popular, and with Roadrunner pretty much replacing Bugs Bunny in the 1960s as Warner Bros. Top-billed character. Throughout the 70s and 80s, old Warner Bros. Cartoons were packaged into Saturday morning cartoon shows, such as the Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner show, which ran all the way up until 1985. If you are of a certain age, you probably have Barbara Cameron's Roadrunner theme song burned into your brain. Thus, a Roadrunner video game in 1985 made perfect sense. In fact, the game began life in 1984 as a Laserdisc game, which used animated intros and backgrounds. The game was never released, but a prototype does still exist. Some footage has been recorded, and we can actually see the Laserdisc animation in the original version. The game was scrapped, and the version that was finally released in 1985 uses standard pixel art for the background. Now, aesthetically speaking, the NES Roadrunner is pretty compromised. It's ugly as heck, and to be honest, it's not a lot of fun to play. There are 6 brief levels which repeat endlessly. To play through all 6 levels without dying takes about 6 minutes, so there's not exactly a lot of content here. The game gets more difficult as you continue to cycle through the levels, as landmines are added onto the road, and various other complications. Now there are other obstacles such as moving trucks that will run over you, but these can also be used to temporarily flatten Wile. For some reason the trucks in this are marked Ace rather than Acme, and you will also need to be constantly picking up birdseed to avoid losing energy and becoming too tired to run. There were a few things that were dropped in the NES port, like buckshot that looked like birdseed, which would allow Wile to use a magnet on you. The trickiest thing here is probably the controls. Roadrunner moves around in kind of a herky-jerky fashion, and it can sometimes be pretty hard to grab the birdseed. Also, the Roadrunner can easily get hung up on corners in these types of areas, and while Roadrunner is a very simple game on paper, actually playing it, you can find yourselves battling the controls a lot. A number of folks may have enjoyed Roadrunner as youngsters, but I doubt you'll find much pleasure in it today. Just the fact that the levels are so short and just repeat endlessly means you'll lose interest pretty quickly. Oh boy, it's Super Sprint from Tengen. If nothing else, the opening music is pretty cool. It's simultaneously chill and also sort of funky. Now, Tengen has been releasing some pretty old-fashioned games like Roadrunner, but Super Sprint is something else. It's a downright archaic top-down racing game. I mean, this thing is stripped down. It's basically just driving around the track over and over again. There are 4 cars on the track, but of course only 2 people can play at once, so there's always going to be 2 AI cars racing against you. Now this is based on Atari Games' 1986 arcade title, which was notable for allowing 3 players at once. This was a pretty chunky cabinet. And please forgive me for being absolutely unable to control my vehicle in these videos. Trying to play games that used analog steering wheel controls with a keyboard is not exactly an optimal setup. Now there's some cool stuff here like the ramp that you jump. If your car crashes and explodes, like a little helicopter will fly out. But the thing is, Super Sprint was just an updated version of one of Atari's earliest arcade games. Sprint 2 released in 1976. Well, technically it was a Key game rather than Atari. But yeah, so the roots of this game are just ancient. Atari put out several variations of this game all throughout the 70s. And the thing is, the NES Super Sprint really isn't that different from the original Sprint 2. It's the same basic concept, just with better graphics and a few extras thrown in, like the wrenches you can pick up. Between races, you can spin them for these very basic upgrades. Nothing too exciting, I'm afraid. And there's also some various obstacles, like these little tornadoes which will cause you to lose control of your car. Don't know why they're holding a professional car race in the middle of a tornado. That seems pretty dangerous to me. Though one annoying thing is that in 1989, Atari Games released Badlands, a modification of Super Sprint with a much cooler post-apocalyptic setting. You can slow down the other vehicles by shooting at them, and among the upgrades you can select are missiles. Yes. Atari released Badlands for so many platforms, DOS, the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, but not the NES. I'd say this would have made a much more interesting NES game than Super Sprint, but oh well. So once again, just like so many Tengen games, Super Sprint is not exactly bad, but you also can't get very excited about it either. Alright, let's keep these Tengen games a-rollin' with Toobin. Pretty rad music on the title screen here, but I feel like this has been used before in some other game. I can't quite recall. Toobin is, incredibly enough, the first video game based on that great American sport, floating in the water on an inner tube. I was not aware that anybody actually called this tubing, and I must confess, this seems like a pretty unexciting subject for a video game. I mean, it's not really a sport, per se. Regardless, we'll start off here on the Colorado River. I'm Biff, apparently. Alright, so there's a pretty high level of abstraction here. The green bags floating in the water are quote-unquote treasure chests, and they give you points. Those red rectangles that you can pick up and throw are quote-unquote cans. The manual doesn't say what's in the cans, but typically one would drink beer while relaxing in the water on an inner tube. Going through these gates will also give you some points. The object is simply to make your way down the river until you reach the end, whereupon you move on to the next river. In this case, the Okefenokee, which is a swamp, not a river, though the famous Swanee River, or more properly the Suwannee, is fed by the Okefenokee Swamp. Now, as you probably have figured out, Toobin began life as an arcade game released in 1988. The arcade Toobin was much easier on the eyes, and unlike the NES game, all the objects, such as beer cans and treasure chests, were much more recognizable. The arcade game also had a unique control scheme. Each player has 4 buttons, one for each limb. So you'd press one button to paddle with your right arm, and another for your right leg, and so on. It also had a very cool motorized marquee. Bringing up Toobin on Twitter, it seemed that more people recalled the arcade version than the home version, which makes sense because Atari Games was still a pretty big player in the arcade world of the late 80s. The game just cycles you forever through a series of rivers. There are around 20 altogether. Some of them are real, like the Rio Grande or the Nile. Others are fictional, like the Styx, which really doesn't sound like a very fun place to go inner-tubing in. There are shortcuts. This whirlpool near the beginning of the Colorado will take you to the Warp Zone, where you can find shortcuts to other rivers, such as the Nevada in this case. As you progress through the various rivers, more and more hazards will appear, and for example, hunters will stand on the banks and shoot at you. They don't like tubers in their hunting grounds, I assume. In the Amazon, Indians will use blowguns at you, and so on. Some levels are quite fanciful, like this futuristic level where you have to avoid robots, toxic waste spills, and violent punk rockers. Tubing is definitely less irritating than Roadrunner, and there's a bit more content simply because there are more levels. But once again, the NES port lacks the character of the arcade game. The incredibly ugly graphics simply don't capture any of the original's charm. I mean, it's not exactly pointless, but Toobin just does not translate well as an NES game. Our first game of 1990 is an RPG. How appropriate. Ganbare Goemon Gaiden, Kieta Utan Kiseru, is the third game in Konami's wacky Ganbare Goemon series. The first two were action games, but this one is, well, like I said just a minute ago, it's an RPG. The first Ganbare Goemon game to be released in the US was the Super Nintendo game called Legend of the Mystical Ninja. None of the Famicom games got any sort of release outside of Japan, but once again we have a pretty good translation. This sets up the tone of the game. It's probably a bit sillier than the first two games, and later games would continue to move in this direction, with all kinds of goofy elements and anachronisms. The story here doesn't involve evil forces threatening the world or anything. All that happens is that Goemon's pipe is missing, so he goes out to find it. His sidekick, the ninja, Ebisumaru, joins him for no apparent reason. This game does pretty much use the standard JRPG rulebook, so it's not really that much different than Glory of Hercules 2, it's just a bit more clever and creative. Now we all know exactly where this is going. You'll walk around town, talk to people, find some invisible money hidden in a corner, stop by the shops and buy the cheapest weapons and armor, then head out and fight random encounters. You know, the usual business. Here we have your typical helmets, gauntlets, and armor available. Overall, this game seems a bit easier than most JRPGs. I got unlucky almost immediately after leaving town and Goemon was killed, and unfortunately I couldn't find any way to revive him in the first village, so I had to restart. Near the starting village we'll find a castle, which serves as the first dungeon. Now I mentioned that this game feels easier than most JRPGs of the time, and we can see what I mean here. Walking around in the castle, the encounter rate is pleasingly low. Enemies are pretty straightforward and don't use any annoying status effects at this point, so you won't get poisoned every other battle. The first boss is actually a cakewalk. He's an official of some sort who you need to beat up in order for him to give you a pass so that you can get through a nearby checkpoint. So once you have the pass, you can show it to the guards and you'll move on to the next area. Don't know why Goemon can't just beat up the guards instead of having to find the pass. I mean, many of the enemies you encounter in this are just regular looking human beings, and Goemon has absolutely no qualms about killing them. Anyway, you make your way through the world on the trail of the guy who has your pipe. You do the usual stuff, rest at inns, buy better equipment, solve some problems for the townspeople. For example, in this town, the canals have all dried up. The enemies tend to be based on traditional Japanese things and monsters, such as, like in this case, a lantern. There's also demons and various folk creatures, sumo wrestlers, you get the idea. So like I was saying, this game feels pretty easy, even the boss battles. Just attacking this guy with regular attacks, he'll go down pretty quickly. I barely took any damage. You'll then get the Aqua Orb, which will restore the town's water, and also apparently cause a lockpick to float up to the top of this well. The lockpick is super helpful in general, but is specifically needed to unlock this door in an underground passage, which allows you to cross this river. The Goemon games like throwing in anachronistic elements and technology, so here for example, you travel to the next area in a train that appears to be foot-powered. Now, despite being an absolutely by-the-numbers RPG in terms of mechanics and overall design, it throws in enough silly elements and goofy surprises to keep the player entertained. For example, you reach a village entirely populated by cats, who will make a little meow sound effect when they speak. Here you'll get drugged and imprisoned by one of the cats. Luckily, you can escape with a fellow prisoner and third-party member by using the lockpick. Then you'll fight off the bad cat. There's a robot theme going on throughout the game, like this giant robot which passes by. Or this inventor's laboratory, which is full of robots. And there's also a naughty scene where Goemon watches a strip show. So it turns out that there are various robot imposters running around, including one of Goemon, which causes this misunderstanding with this ninja girl who fights you and easily defeats you. You then need to battle the imposter robot Goemon, then the ninja girl becomes your fourth and final party member. You will eventually get your pipe back, and the final bosses are giant robots. So it's a pretty simple RPG which has a surplus of charm. Is this worth playing? Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, it has a very different tone than most RPGs, so you might find it somewhat entertaining. It's definitely a little different. Man, that is some opening. Okay, so let's keep going with January. January 6th, Adventures of Lolo. This is the third, fourth, maybe Eggerland game that we've seen. Yeah, so it's this BS again, pushing around little blocks. As a reminder, the Eggerland games were a series of puzzle games from HAL Laboratory that began life on the MSX, then moved to the Famicom and FDS, and finally got a release in the US under the name The Adventures of Lolo. This US game was just a compilation of various levels from the earlier Japanese games. However, HAL must have realized that Adventures of Lolo was a much more appealing name than Eggerland, so they decided to borrow it for this, the newest Japanese entry in the series. Then 2 months later this was released in the US, but since HAL had already used the name Adventures of Lolo for the first US game, they gave this one the title Adventures of Lolo II. Okay, but here's the thing. They changed a lot of levels for the US version. Both versions have 50 levels, but some, not all of them, are different. So Adventures of Lolo and Adventures of Lolo 2 are the same game, except that they're not. Now, probably assuming that US gamers were not like the hardened Eggerland players that Japanese gamers were, Adventures of Lolo 2 starts you off nice and gentle. As a reminder, the Eggerland games are a series of puzzle games comprising a series of single-screen rooms which you need to escape from. This is done by collecting all the hearts in each room in order to unlock the exit door. The rooms are filled with enemies. Some, like these little green slugs, are harmless, but they do block your way. There are many enemy types, and some are considerably more dangerous than others. Some levels give you a weapon that turns enemies into eggs that can be pushed. In other levels, you'll need to rely solely on pushing blocks around. Okay, you need to be a genius to figure this one out. Japanese puzzle games love this particular unintuitive block pushing puzzle. It appears in Sokoban games and was even used in a Dragon Quest game once. No, that's not right. It's very easy to make a mistake that can't be undone. You can only push blocks, not pull them. If this happens, you'll need to hit the suicide button, which takes away one life but resets the level. Okay, so here's the correct solution. For the most part, the game revolves around pushing blocks in order to access the hearts and also protect yourself from monsters. For example, these gray chia pet looking things will shoot spikes in all 4 cardinal directions, resulting in instant death if you step on the same column or row as them. So in order to get past them, you'll need to push blocks in order to block their attack. Clearly, each room is just a matrix of tiles, each of which is either empty or occupied by an enemy, a block, or other objects. But when pushing blocks, they don't really quite snap into place. It's very easy to accidentally push them just a little too far. For example, this block here. I pushed it just a wee bit too far and now I can't move it to the left. For me at least, pushing blocks just a smidgen too far was pretty much the main reason I'd have to start the level over again, and I found this to be very frustrating. Alright, so one last game and we're done with January. This month has been a piece of cake so far. Let's finish off with a game that none of you either know or care about. Igo Meikan is sort of an educational game, which helps you learn to play Igo, the game that we usually call Go in the West. There are multiple modes to choose from in the menu. This one, for example, just runs through hypothetical Go games and shows you the correct moves to make in response to your opponent's moves. Other, more interactive modes have you try to choose the correct move, so the computer will put down a piece and you will need to choose the correct play. If you choose incorrectly, the game will show you the correct choice. Another mode will make it a bit easier by showing you several possible choices, and you need to select which one is correct. Now there's a couple unusual things about this game. Smaller publishers sometimes had unusual packaging, and Igo Meikan came in sort of a clamshell style box, as seen here. Also, while the game was developed by Hector, it was published by Aoki Shoten, a book publisher. Aoki Shoten started life as a bookstore run by one Haruo Aoki, and later started publishing books often on subjects such as Marxism and philosophy. As far as I can tell, they are still around today. And to my knowledge, this is Aoki Shoten's only venture into video games. So, sorry, it's not a very exciting way to end an episode on, but I've got to play by the rules. Well, that wraps it up for the entire damn year of 1989. Best game this episode? Hell, I don't know. Batman? That's probably what you kids would choose, right? The Batman game? Sure, why not? Worst? I'm gonna say Shinobi. It's just that in 2020 this is so unnecessary. It's the worst console port of Shinobi that we've seen. Having to earn your ninja magic through the bonus levels really sucks. I just don't think there's really any reason to play this at this point in time. Next up will be the new Video Nasties episode, part 1 of our examination of the career of Herschel Gordon Lewis, where we do a deep dive into his 1963, well, I can't call it a masterpiece or a tour de force, we'll just say his 1963 strip of celluloid, Blood Feast. Following this up will be Chrontendo episode 55, which despite only being 10 games long, will still have 2 huge blockbuster titles, so there's something to look forward to. So once again, thanks for watching, and a big shout out to all the patrons.